It is now my great pleasure to introduce to you Fran Katsoudas, who's with us here in Warsaw, and joining us shortly via satellite from the US will be Karl-Henrik Svanberg. Fran is co-chair of Global Citizens Board of Directors, and she's also Chief People, Policy and Purpose Officer for Cisco. I got it. Okay, PPP. And Carl, when he joins us, I'll do a quick intro. He's representing the European private sector community. So he will join us shortly. And he also heads up the Roundtable for Industry in Europe. And he's the chairman of Volvo. We're working to bring him into the conversation. A warm welcome to you, Fran. President von der Leyen, to turn to you once more. We know that conflict is one of the greatest threats to education. And according to UNICEF, more than 350,000 children in Ukraine have already lost access to education. So, Madam President, my question to you is this: how do we ensure that this doesn't become the last issue that gets funded, and that we don't end up with a generation of displaced youth with a lost education and compromised health?
Yes. Indeed, this is one of the most pressing questions, because many of the refugees are young children and they need immediately access to schools. And of course, children need other children, so be with their peer groups. And therefore, the pledging here is also part of supporting the member states who have refugees and children. I was traveling to Kyiv with the Slovak Prime Minister, and he told me that in the last 4 weeks, they got 700 children that need immediately access to kindergarten, for example. So it's just also you need teachers, you need classrooms, very practical thing, very down to earth. And therefore, it is so necessary that we support them in that. But also health issues. The normal access to health care is important, but we have, for example, many that come that are not vaccinated, not only against COVID, but also the basic vaccinations that you get normally in your childhood. So this has to be done. Or there are many that come that have other diseases that normally are not so present in the population. So the access to healthcare is eminent, extremely important. All these are topics where the member states are really doing a great job and doing the utmost to accommodate, but the more support they get, the better. And then there is a last point. I just wanted to refer to Arina's last comment. Arina, you're so right. Arina wanted to tell us, rightly so, that, of course, we are now speaking about the refugees. But we also have to be very clear towards Putin that this cannot be this aggression. And therefore, we are imposing heavy sanctions on Putin and his war machine to really dry out that. Economic sanctions, financial sanctions. And Arina is right. What we have to do is get rid of the fossil fuel dependency from Russia. This is for us so important. So we got out of coal, we are looking into oil, and Arina, what we have to do is not only diversify away from the Russian fossil fuel, but massive investment in renewables. This is not only good for a strategic investment in independence, but it is of course also good for our climate and for our planet. So many tasks to look at, and I just wanted to support you on that point, Arina. It is a very important one.
Well, you can be sure the young will lead the way. We are always grateful for the bravery of the young, and here that's what Global Citizen is all about, activating these young voices to get involved. I want to talk to you about something specific, Hugh. Even before the invasion began, we know that global humanitarian aid budgets were already being strained, that not just humanitarian aid budgets, but development budgets as well were under severe strain after 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic. I've got to ask you, again, considering this is one of the core drivers of Global Citizens' work, how will this invasion impact efforts to reduce poverty and hunger, and what must governments do?
Thank you, Aisha. So I think, firstly, it's important to acknowledge that during the pandemic alone, 120 million people were pushed into extreme poverty as a result of COVID-19, even before this invasion occurred. And we know that hunger has been on the rise in the last 4 years. We know that climate change continues to be one of this generation's greatest challenges, I believe, alongside the challenge of ending extreme poverty. And we also know that right now in Ethiopia, they're suffering from one of the worst climate-induced droughts in decades. This was all before the invasion, and the invasion is going to exacerbate these currently existing challenges. At the same time, because governments are facing so many competing pressures, as we're talking about, pressure to invest in this or this, I think the question we have to grapple with is this is really not a question of wallet, it's a question of will. Because we've seen how governments can rally in times of crisis. We saw it during the pandemic where trillions of dollars were invested when it was necessary. And I would argue right now it's absolutely necessary to invest into the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, because we're then investing in the future of women and girls, we're investing in the future of our planet, and we're investing in everyone's shared prosperity. And that's why I'm really proud to work alongside Prime Minister Trudeau and President Ursula von der Leyen, because I think these are world leaders who exemplify big tent foreign policy rather than zero-sum thinking. I think we need to encourage leaders that really encourage a big tent philosophy, not a zero-sum game where one person's benefit is another person's loss. This is a world where we have adequate resources. We need to allocate those resources accordingly. And so I believe now is the time to double down, and as we head towards really ongoing efforts to mobilize global citizens around the world, this intersection between democracy and the eradication of extreme poverty has been stronger now more than ever. We need to really uphold and support world leaders who invest in the future of our planet.
Hugh, thank you so much for that. Thank you. As you said, it's not about wallet, it's about will. And I want everyone to remember that. And there's more than enough money to do this work. Prime Minister Trudeau, if I could bring you in here, the immediacy of the social media-driven news cycle is driving the way we're consuming news. We've all seen the heartbreaking images of hospitals being targeted in Ukraine, and we've read the many stories of medical supply lines being blocked. We know that the sudden and the significant flow of refugees has put strain on healthcare systems. So I want to spend a moment and focus on that and get your thoughts on how conflict impacts healthcare systems and what must international governments do.
Thank you very much. First of all, one of the things that we've seen over the past years, whether it was the COVID crisis or whether it's this war in Ukraine, everything's interconnected around the world. None of us are fully isolated from impacts of what's going on elsewhere. That's why I thank Hugh for bringing up the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals from the UN. I'm actually co-leading with Mia Motley of Barbados a push to really make sure that countries are buying in fully on this with not just the money, but the will, as Hugh mentions. But we need to respect and understand that the focus that Putin has had on impacting civilian infrastructure, whether it's the train station we saw recently, whether it's civilians in Bucha, or whether it's maternity wards or hospitals, there is a deliberate attempt to cause as much long-term damage as possible to the Ukrainian people. And that is where the world does need to continue to stand up. Obviously, we need to be there to help heal the war wounds right now. But we also know there will be young people, as Ursula talked about, impacted for decades by the violence, by the horrors of war. We need to make sure we're there to build resilience, there to deal with the mental health consequences as well of the trauma, of the loss, of the grief, of the fear that has been brought in, that stability that the world has started to take for granted in many places is now highlighted that it's not automatic. And we need to continue to be there for each other, even as we stand up for each other and stand for Ukraine.
Mr. Prime Minister, thank you. Thank you. I want to shift gears now and talk about the private sector, which has a big role to play in moments of crisis like this one. Fran, if I could bring you in here, I want us to talk big picture and really talk to me about how the expectations of the private sector have changed among employees, customers, and society at large over the last couple of years.
Thank you, Isha. I think this is so important. So the first thing that I would say is the issues that we're dealing with are so complex that they require the private sector to really support and to partner with NGOs and governments. I think one of the learnings that we had throughout COVID was that companies found their way to really focus on their employees, their well-being, their health, their mental health. And this was a really important step for us. And I think the big question now for companies is that same focus and accountability that we have to our people, can we get there where we feel that accountability to communities around the world? And I think the most amazing thing is that for many companies, the answer is yes. And you see them showing up and supporting, and we see that here in Poland and Ukraine, which is beautiful. But there's a call to action for all of us to learn what it means to be a corporate citizen. And when we are a corporate citizen, I think what that means is that we're focused on the digital divide. We're focused on issues like education and how we can play a role, and especially now having 4 million displaced people that really need our help. We have to focus on social justice and equality for all. We have to focus on the environment. We have to focus on the systems, how we build to a regenerative planet. And I think that's really the opportunity. And for those in the private sector that have stepped up, and there's so many, I think we want to say a huge thank you to you. And we need to acknowledge that there's so much work to be done, and that together from a corporation perspective, we stand for Ukraine.
Thank you for that, Fran.
Thank you.
And I'm pleased to say we have Carl-Henrik with us, joining us from the US. Thank you so much for being with us. Can you give us your sense of how the European private sector is stepping up in this moment?
Isha, and thanks for organizing invite here. What is happening now in Ukraine is, of course, touches people. Who would have thought once again we would see a war? President Zelensky's words were probably maybe he's probably the biggest leader of our time. He and the Ukrainians, they're fighting for their life, they're fighting for their food, they're fighting for their country. They're standing up for our.
Carl-Henrik, apologies. We're having some tech issues with you, so we're going to interrupt, and apologies to all of you watching and here in the room. The tech gremlins got him. Apologies. So we're going to move on because, you know, building on what Fran said and what Carl was building up to is that the private sector is stepping up.